She wouldn't allow him to reduce her to the stereotype he held in his mind. She wasn't going to become the angry, emotional woman he expected. Instead, she would stand her ground with dignity. She didn't need to raise her voice or prove anything to him. She would not leave without making it clear that she had every right to be here, not just because of who her son was, but because of who she was. Looking him straight in the eyes, Mrs. Johnson stated, "I'll wait for the manager." For a brief moment, the waiter's smirk faltered, uncertainty crossing his features, but it was fleeting. He turned sharply on his heel, muttering something as he walked away, leaving Mrs. Johnson standing at the counter, alone but unbowed. The eyes of the restaurant were still on her, whispers growing louder, yet she remained steadfast. Mrs. Johnson had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do in the face of injustice was to stand your ground quietly with dignity. The waiter returned with a smug expression, clearly unbothered by her request. He likely assumed this would be another easy dismissal, a quick resolution where a complaint would be brushed aside. But Mrs. Johnson was determined not to let this moment of indignity slip away. A few minutes passed before the manager appeared, hurriedly making his way over, a slight frown forming as he surveyed the room. Initially, he seemed uninterested, preparing for another minor disruption to handle swiftly. But when he caught sight of Mrs. Johnson's face, his demeanor shifted. Recognition flickered in his eyes, and with it, the weight of the situation dawned on him. Mrs. Johnson wasn't just another upset diner. She was the mother of the restaurant's owner. Suddenly, the significance of her presence became clear, not just because of her connection to the establishment, but also because of who she was and what she represented. This wasn't just a personal complaint, it was a moral imperative. And this is a matter that could escalate far beyond this room, the manager acknowledged, his voice now tinged with apprehension. The casual demeanor he had intended faltered as he glanced at the waiter, still behind the counter, oblivious to the depth of his mistake. "I'm terribly sorry about the confusion. Let me find you a table right away." Mrs. Johnson regarded the manager with a calm but unyielding expression. His rushed attempt to resolve the issue felt like an instinctive reaction to quell the immediate problem without addressing its root cause. She had witnessed this scenario countless times before. The quick apology and surface-level solutions designed to silence disturbances, all while ignoring the real issue at hand. "Thank you," she replied evenly, her voice controlled. "But I think there's more we need to discuss before finding a table." The manager's face tightened, realizing this wouldn't be as easy as he had hoped. He could feel the eyes of other diners on him, their quiet murmurs rising in the background. His gaze darted nervously around the room, aware that the longer this confrontation continued, the more attention it would attract. "I understand," he said, shifting to a tone of forced politeness. "It was a misunderstanding, I'm sure. We value all our customers here." Mrs. Johnson raised an eyebrow slightly, sensing the insincerity in his words. "A misunderstanding?" she echoed, her voice soft yet firm. "No, this wasn't just a misunderstanding. What happened today wasn't about a table or a reservation. It was about respect, or, more accurately, the lack of it." The manager visibly stiffened, glancing at the waiter, who was now shifting uncomfortably and avoiding eye contact with Mrs. Johnson. The earlier arrogance in the young man's posture had been replaced with unease. "You're absolutely right," the manager replied quickly, trying to salvage the situation. "I assure you we will address this appropriately. Please allow me to seat you." But Mrs. Johnson wouldn't let the moment pass. "This isn't just about seating me," she continued, her voice calm yet filled with quiet authority. "It's about ensuring this doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone who walks through those doors." She could see the manager's discomfort deepen, the realization sinking in that this wouldn't end with a simple apology or quick seating. This was evolving into something much larger, a statement about how the restaurant treated its customers and how it viewed people like her. The quiet buzz in the restaurant grew louder, with phones being lifted and screens discreetly pointed toward the interaction. Mrs. Johnson noticed but didn't flinch. She had faced the spotlight before and wouldn't shy away from it now. The manager, sensing the rising tension, attempted to regain control. "We take these matters very seriously," he stated, his voice louder as if addressing the other diners as much as Mrs. Johnson. "This behavior does not represent our values, and I assure you it will be addressed immediately." Yet Mrs. Johnson could see through his words. They were the same empty promises she had heard countless times before, assurances of change that never materialized. "I appreciate that," she replied, still composed, "but I'm not looking for a quick fix. I'm seeking accountability, more than just an apology or a table." The manager opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He knew she was right. There was no easy way out of this situation, no polite exit that would restore normalcy. The stakes had risen, with other patrons watching and cameras capturing the moment. Mrs. Johnson stood firm, her presence commanding yet non-confrontational. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her calm dignity lent weight to her words. The manager knew he had to act decisively, but he was painfully aware of how delicate the situation had become. "I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Johnson," he said again, this time with genuine sincerity, his earlier professionalism cracking under pressure. "I'll speak with the owner directly about this, and we will ensure it's handled properly. Please believe me." Mrs. Johnson met his gaze unflinchingly. "I'll hold you to that," she replied simply, knowing her son would hear about this soon. But for now, she wanted to see the situation addressed internally. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted completely. What began as a quiet exchange had turned into a focal point. Patrons whispered among themselves, some in shock, others nodding in agreement with her words. The story was already spreading beyond the restaurant's walls, shared widely on social media as customers filmed the interaction. Sensing the mounting pressure, the manager realized this was about more than just appeasing a single customer. It was about the restaurant's entire reputation. He straightened his back, his face serious. "I'll handle this personally," he promised, lowering his voice to salvage a bit of privacy in this very public situation. "I'll speak with the staff, and we'll ensure this never happens again." Mrs. Johnson nodded, acknowledging his words, but knowing it would take more than a few conversations to address the deeper issues at play. She wasn't seeking personal vengeance or a spectacle. She was standing up for something far larger than herself. "I'll be watching," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that needed no amplification. The manager, fully grasping the gravity of her words, nodded solemnly. Later that afternoon, Marcus, her son, stumbled upon a video that made him freeze. It was a clip posted by a diner at his restaurant, captioned, "Waiter humiliates elderly black woman at local restaurant. Shameful." His heart sank as he hit play, and within seconds he recognized the familiar surroundings of his own establishment. But it was the sight of his mother standing tall and composed in the face of blatant disrespect that made his stomach churn. The young waiter's smugness and the manager's inadequate attempts to resolve the situation hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just any customer being mistreated. It was his mother, the very woman who had helped him build everything he had. The restaurant, once a symbol of inclusivity, warmth, and community, was now a backdrop for humiliation. The realization ignited a fury within him that he hadn't felt in years. Without a second thought, he grabbed his keys and headed straight for the restaurant. The drive over was a blur as his mind raced through every possible scenario, emotions swinging between anger and disbelief. How could this have happened? How could his staff allow this in his own establishment? The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. One thing was clear. This situation would not go unresolved. When Marcus pushed open the door to the restaurant, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The usual hum of conversations fell silent as patrons recognized him, their eyes darting between him and the unfolding scene. The tension in the air was palpable. He spotted his mother near the counter, calm yet resolute, while the manager and waiter stood a few feet away, oblivious. The waiter was the first to notice Marcus entering, and the color drained from his face as realization hit him. Marcus was not just any patron. He was the son of the woman he had just disrespected. The arrogance that had characterized the waiter's posture moments before vanished, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Marcus approached silently, his jaw clenched, eyes locked on the manager and the waiter.